Good morning. Thank you so much for that introduction, Tim. And I would just also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land we gather on today, the Noongar people, their elders past and present. And I'd like to acknowledge Minister McTiernan for being here today. It's just so exciting for me to be in WA. I was born here. I grew up here, I went to school here, but I haven't had the opportunity to work here for 20 years or so. So it's just always a treat for me to be here in WA and enjoy your beautiful sky. And how exciting to hear how this state is tackling regional development. I think it's a bit of a it sounds a little bit cliche now, but it's a really exciting time to be in Western Australia, I think. I was invited to speak here today about my experience working in clusters as a cluster manager in Queensland some years ago, and more recently as CEO of an economic development organisation in New South Wales, which Tim mentioned, Blue Mountains Economic Enterprise. And that organisation really champions clusters as a means for growing competitiveness. And I must say, I always love hearing E4 speak about this topic. I first met E4 in Cairns, probably more years than we care to remember ago, but it was really a couple of years after I had taken on the role of CEO of Super Yacht Group, Great Barrier Reef, which was at that time defined as an industry cluster. So when I first started working with the Super Yacht Cluster, they were a loose group of 20 or so marine suppliers who knew that their key markets of Navy patrol boats, fishing trawlers, and some tourism was drying up. So this really was an industry at a point of change and crisis. We needed to examine what we had and what we could do with what we had at that time. So Cairns, as a port of entry to Australia from the South Pacific, just really opportunistically, I must say, attracted around 8 super yachts to its port every year. And that was valued at around $15 million to the local economy. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar, super yachts are those crazy luxury privately owned vessels, 24 metres and more in length. The average price tag, if you're in the market for one, around $40 million. And of course, traditionally, super yachts cruise the Mediterranean or the Caribbean. And it had at that time been identified that there was potential to develop Cairns as a super yacht destination. And when I say we, I really mean the industry players. So this group of painters, slipways, fabricators, carpenters, agents, providors, fuel suppliers, this was a very grassroots group. The approach was not a top-down one with the economic development agencies telling these guys what to do. It was in fact quite the reverse. So what did we do? Well, we got people talking to each other, just in the way that E4 tells us to do. We did that quite naturally, and we really expanded the group so that we had a full story to tell. We developed a shared vision which was to position and champion Cairns, Australia, as a leading super yacht destination for refit, cruising, charter and training. And we had massive constraints. We had doubt and naysayers right from the beginning. One of my first memories was a call from the outgoing CEO of the Port Authority at that time. He was leaving that job, and he rang just to tell me categorically that I was completely wasting my time. Why on earth would Cairns attract super yachts when they could go to Sydney Harbour and get that picture in front of the bridge? So he left that role, as I say, and went to manage a port in Egypt for a while. And he returned a few years later. And I have to say, one of the most satisfying moments of my career was receiving his call, actually apologising for ever doubting the vision, because we were actually able to prove him wrong. And he's actually the mayor of Cairns now, so, swings and roundabouts, I guess. But what did a cluster look like in that context? Well, the Super Yacht Cluster capitalised on its opportunities. We developed a strategic plan with market development, relationship management, skills development, operational issues such as infrastructure and regulatory impediments. The key market activities involved international boat shows, targeted signposting visits. Media and PR played a huge role. We had to remove legislative constraints and regulation which blocked the competitiveness of the region. So as you can see, the cluster involved a lot more than simply sending a rep to a boat show with some glossy brochures. And collaboration was certainly much more than just people paying their membership. It was all about building trust. So in the early days, there was the inevitable unwillingness to share information regarding the vessels visiting. So through the cluster, we were able to channel the market intelligence, and that led to better communication, workforce planning and efficiency. And I'm often asked, and I know E4 is also asked this question, if there's a template position description for a cluster manager. And it's honestly just an impossible task to write one. The role requires you to be, as that slide indicated, a bridge builder. As E4 says, often the glue. And you will find yourselves dealing with what can absolutely feel like a psychiatric cabaret. You know, you've got egos, money, and relationships at stake. And it's tricky business. It absolutely is. So one of my best memories is two main owners of the two main shipyards in North Queensland had known each other for well over 30 years, but refused to have a beer together, would not socialise, did not want to know each other. But we slowly chipped away, and after 5 years, we actually had them exhibiting at international boat shows together with regional branding, not their own company branding. And for me, that was a big KPI, you know, in my mind. So within 5 years, Cairns became the most visited super yacht port in the South Pacific. The cluster had more than 70 members, which built from a base of 20. And for many years, we attracted over 50 vessels each year to the city. So remembering that grew from just that opportunistic 8 that we would get. And that growth represented around 50 million to the local economy of Cairns. And of course, the key to the competitiveness of Cairns as a leading super yacht destination lay not only in good geography, although that, of course, was part of the formula. The key, to my mind, really was that collaboration by industry. The key, we just didn't bring anything really to the region. I mean, we enhanced the marina facilities, but that was all sort of going to happen anyway. We didn't spend a fortune on anything. We just helped the region collaborate. We generated a buy-in and those shared values, and we worked out what we could do with what we had, and we worked really, really hard to be the best. So after leaving Cairns, I moved to the Blue Mountains, which is as insane as it sounds in terms of temperature change. And I was engaged as CEO of Blue Mountains Economic Enterprise, which just 5 years ago was a brand new economic development organisation funded by local government. Now, I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with the Blue Mountains, but it has 27 villages along a ridgeline. Now, if you guys working in Perth think having a north and south of the river is tricky, try 27 villages spread along a ridgeline, each of them with their own sense of identity and place. That, in a context of the city being the only proclaimed city within a World Heritage Area and a local environment planning scheme that makes it almost impossible to build infrastructure, we have inherent challenges in terms of economic development for this region. But of course, when we started, we undertook economic analysis and we identified the key drivers, which were unsurprisingly tourism, food, health and well-being. And at the same time, I was approached by a number of creative networks and individuals who were keen to talk about collaboration amongst the creative groups that existed in the region. Now, the Blue Mountains has always been known as a creative place. It's a bit of a historical artist retreat. But at that time, you know, I wasn't sure if we were talking about sock monkeys and knitting. You know, what? It's creative, so what? So we really did a deep dive study into that sector, and it soon became very apparent that we were not talking about sock monkeys and knitting. Not that there's anything wrong with that if there are knitters in the room. The creative industries, in fact, is the third greatest contributor to the gross regional product of the Blue Mountains. It represents about $500 million in output. 8% of local jobs are in this sector, and we know that the residents that we have are about double national and state averages in terms of employment in the creative industries. So the Blue Mountains is for sure a creative industries hotspot. So then it was, of course, very natural for me to support the development of a creative industries cluster. And we knew, again, there was a great spirit of collaboration in the mountains, but as we've heard from E4 and from others, collaboration needs to be mobilised and best if by a dedicated entity in order for it to drive economic development and jobs. It doesn't just happen automatically, and it's not just enough to have people in the same room networking. All of the global productivity research tells us that if we can fire up a culture of connectivity and collaboration, we can drive innovation. And that's exactly what the cluster is designed to do. And in the Blue Mountains, in the Creative Industries cluster, it's certainly working. So since we started this cluster in 2013, we've engaged with over 4,000 businesses and professionals. We developed a regional cultural identity and brand, the Mountains Made brand. And the first campaign, we just launched the second one a couple of weeks ago. The first campaign generated over 60,000 views of the video, driving traffic to the Mountains Made directory, which showcases over 450 Blue Mountains creative businesses. The campaign has attracted creative businesses to relocate, to start and to grow in the mountains. So we can actually track job creation through this initiative. BMEE, the organisation I manage, has brokered retailed contract for local artists and makers using this brand worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, placing their products in retail outlets that attract over 1 million people a year. So these very highly visited tourist attractions that one artist would never get a Guernsey in, you know. So through this brand, they've got the capability to showcase, and they've been able to ramp up production through that. The Blue Mountains was showcased on a global stage at Vivid Ideas in Sydney last year, and our Creative Industries Cluster Manager receives regular emails from people thanking her for facilitating the introduction that created the partnership that secured the lucrative job, for referring the client to them, for supporting them in a myriad of ways. Mountains Made was recognised by Economic Development Australia as a finalist in the National Awards last year and has been profiled in national and international media. This campaign has raised the profile of the region and set a new narrative for the Blue Mountains as a truly world-class creative hub. Now, E4 will attest to this. In the Blue Mountains, we had a real challenge in the beginning, and it took much effort to convince some of our local councillors of the value of what we were talking about. We were starting, were we not, E4, from scratch. So good PR and communication is so important. They need to see the low-hanging fruit, as we say, and I certainly made it my mission to develop some measurables so we could draw as soon as possible some causality between the work of the cluster and the economy. In Cairns, that was not that difficult. We had huge, beautiful yachts in the marina, and we knew if we had not done this work, it would not be there. They'd never been there before. So, of course, with creative industries, it's much less visible. So one way I achieved this was 4 of our local filmmakers shared their local expenditure with us over a 12-month period. And we had that data analysed, and we were just a few weeks ago able to release that report that showed that 4 films linked to the cluster generated over $13.5 million to the local economy of the Blue Mountains, which doesn't sound like a lot, but for the first round in a small community like that, it really has lifted the support for the cluster, and to be able to have some tangible figures just can never be overstated. The cluster case study also showed 40 full-time equivalent local jobs were created as a result of these films. And what's interesting here is that each of the film producers acknowledged the role that BMEE played and the cluster in keeping the production in the Blue Mountains. So one in particular film that's just been released internationally to about 30 global markets, would have been produced in Vanuatu if not for the cluster. So it's great to be able to prove that return on investment to your funders. Similarly pleasing, as we've heard from our previous speaker, is that now we're really seeing the New South Wales government and other governments such as this one recognising the value of industry clusters. New South Wales clusters account for over 26% of recent job growth in New South Wales, and the fact that New South Wales government is starting to recognise clusters as a way to provide levers for growth is just great. As someone who has advocated for this sort of recognition for 15 years, doing the work on the ground, it's just great to see some of the policy settings getting put into place. And personally, I very much look forward to continuing the conversation here in Perth and around the country in my new role as Executive Officer of Economic Development Australia. So look, I hope that gives you some idea, some practical insight into the work on the ground.